Hey guys, welcome back to part 5 of Japanese Kana They Don't Teach You at School. My name is Xiao. Today we are talking about the mostly obsolete but usually prominent saying called Hentaigana. As you can see on screen, we have some examples. These are real kana used in the past. This video will be a bit long since there's a lot to Hentaigana, but here's a short version. In the past, there were more than one kana for the same sound, way more in fact, than what I'm showing here as an example. And Japanese government during Meiji period picked one kana for each sound, presumably to make Japanese writing system easier to teach to boost literacy. And those they picked became what we know as kana today. And those got left out are now considered variant kana or hentaigana. Hentai meaning variant form. Now, technically, Hentaigana were not banned. Only standard kana were taught in like first or second grade, so Hentaigana just phased out naturally over time. At present day, most Japanese people will not be able to read them unless they learn it in university under classical literature or they learn calligraphy. That being said, if you know what they are and you pay attention to them, you can still find them in modern day Japan on shop signs or sometimes, surprisingly, chopstick wrappers. I certainly found them. And to the right, we have some examples of modern signs. Udon, soba, dango, these are all food. I guess it's kind of similar to how you'd say VO something in English on signs. The obsolete spelling itself becomes a kind of expression. But why were there a lot of kana in the first place? Well, rest of this video is dedicated to explaining that story. You probably already learned in school that the Japanese writing system came from Chinese and kana came from kanji. That is a simple and easy answer to the question, but as you'll see today, it's not the whole story. Kana started from this system of writing Japanese with Chinese characters called Manyogana. So what is Manyogana? Imagine you're a Japanese elite in the 8th century and China was the most advanced civilization you know, and you are an international student sent to China. While you are in China, you learn to read and write Chinese, the then common language of East Asia. And now you're back in Japan and you want to record some, let's say, Japanese poems to preserve the culture of your time in ink. What do? Well, the idea of spelling things with the sound of Chinese characters is not exactly new even back then. In the oldest textual recording of Japan, which dates to the 3rd century, that is already happening, as we can see here an example. And this still happens to this day. Basically, it's just one of the ways to do loanwords in Chinese. Just use the Chinese characters with the same sound. So naturally, you come up with the idea of recording the sound of Japanese with whatever Chinese character that sounded most similar. Except you'll no longer be limited by just a few words. You start to write whole sentences and then paragraphs. That's kind of what Manyogana is. It's got more complexity to that, but this is the part that's most relevant to Hentaigana. Now this might sound like extra trouble compared to how Korean did it, but it would have made a lot of sense back then if you speak both languages. Of course, today the sound of Chinese characters changed and sound of grammar of Japanese language also changed, so even though I personally speak both languages, I can't read them. Another thing to note here is, as the name suggests, Manyogana is kana. So at this stage, what we have is not kanji becoming kana, but kanji being used as kana. And to get to the kana we are familiar with today from Manyogana, well, you probably learned this at school. Kana comes from the cursive Chinese characters. 3 images in the middle are taken from old Chinese manuscripts for the same character. And in case of this kana, it's basically exactly the same as its corresponding cursive Chinese character. And now let's talk about why this is important in the context of Hentaigana. When you write a Chinese character in cursive, not everyone does it the same way, resulting in a few distinct forms of the same character. I'm only showing 2 here, but it can be more. Sometimes these forms both end up as distinct kana, and the ones that lost out are today's Hentaigana. You can kind of tell when this happens by just looking at some of the Hentaigana, since they either have a similar structure due to their origin, or they look like different stages of simplification, one simpler than the other of the same character. In the case you're wondering, yes, a few Hentaigana are basically simplified Chinese characters, but I digress. What I just said might make you think kana are just cursive Chinese characters, but that's not exactly the case. As you can see here for these two characters, the kana a and ka, the hiragana from cursive Chinese ended up Hentaigana. And the hiragana, as far as I can tell, only seen in Japan, will go on to become the standard. And this is what we mean when we say kana are based on cursive Chinese. In fact, if you examine all the kana today, most of them are somewhat different to cursive Chinese, at least the ones I could find. Although when it comes to Hentaigana, you usually find one or two that's exactly the same. And different forms of the same character is not the only way you can get more than one kana. In Chinese, there's usually many characters that share the same sound. So when Manyosyu was created, people took whichever character they feel like at the time. And this is also how it is in Chinese today with loanwords, by the way. It's not a big problem, provided you can read all those characters. And you know where this is going. It's not for every Manyosyu, but many of those Manyosyu will become Hiragana. And this is another reason the same sound can have multiple kana with very distinct forms. To put what we just learned together, one sound in Japanese could have many source characters in Manyosyu. To the right, we have dotted line in blue, indicating those with different source character but same sound. And for each source character, you can have more than one cursive form adopted into hiragana. Some would be close to the source character, some are very simple and omits a lot of details. And all those are considered distinct, different kana, even if they are from the same source. And you will see old Japanese texts mixing them. We'll talk about that in detail very soon, but let's first get to the elephant in the room. So far, I've talked about hiragana exclusively, and it's true Hentaigana are basically about hiragana. But you might wonder, what about katakana? Well, katakana also evolved from Manyosyu. It's just instead of cursive, they come to be as parts taken from the regular form of those characters, which you might learn in school. And by the way, you might notice how katakana come from different Chinese characters than hiragana when you first study them. Well, now you know why. Those source characters were used as the same sound in Manyosyu. As to variants of katakana, the two cases you see here are basically the only ones I could find real use of, and the bottom one is kind of doesn't count because if you watch this series, you already know. And even these examples are rare, so katakana was quite standardized during Meiji period already, but I was also able to find a book talking about a lot more variant katakana, just doesn't have any example of them in use. If you want to read it for yourself, sources in the description. Now, Hentaigana are basically used interchangeably, but there are some trends that can be seen in older texts. What I'm showing you here comes from this paper, links in the descriptions. The first one here is how certain words are always spelled with the same specific kana. For example, kyo is almost always spelled with this particular Hentaigana ke. Another one which I find very interesting is how kana used would change depending on where they are in a phrase. So basically you'd use one kana in the beginning of a word and another one in other places, which kind of reminds me of how other languages with similar features. It's interesting to know Japanese used to have this feature too. A very noticeable example here is the subject marker ha, and a specific Hentaigana associated to it that kind of looks like a katakana ha. I have to say this actually made it easier to read, not harder. Kind of like the object marker o. The two other trends using Hentaigana is if a kana repeats, a different kana would be used, so they wouldn't write the same kana twice. Although this is not very common once they started using iteration marks. And features provided by some of the modern conveniences such as diacritics and small kana, which didn't used to exist or wasn't popular or standard back then, were done simply using another kana one. I think that's easy to think of when you have a bunch of them. Being someone who knows how kana works today and you've just seen Hentaigana, you might think, what a mess Hentaigana was. But at the end of this video, I also want to talk a bit about the philosophy of whether to reform a language. You see, as much as a headache learning a few hundred Hentaigana is, Japanese then wasn't impossibly difficult. English has a pretty bad spelling system that desperately needs reform, and people just managed to get by. Not to mention, Hentaigana wasn't that much of a problem compared to kanji, which there used to be way more in case you didn't know. And the downside of this reform is, written language isn't just a tool to communicate with your friends and other people of your time, but also a tool to communicate with the future. And with this reform, today's Japanese people are no longer literate, in a sense, in their own language 2 centuries ago. So if you're from the United States, imagine you won't be able to read any documents around the time of Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence. That's how it's like. And I think Hentaigana is something interesting to think about, not just because it's fun to be a language nerd, which you probably are if you're watching this, but also we are discussing reforming languages today as well. Sometimes it's because written language is getting too old and drifted too much from spoken words, and you want to unify them. Sometimes to make it easy to learn, and sometimes it's political. It's got something to do with the rights of certain groups of people or certain countries. As I'm writing this, there's a war that grabbed the attention of people around the world between Russia and Ukraine. It might come to you as a surprise, but this war forever changed the Japanese language in, however, a small way. The spellings of certain Ukrainian cities in Japanese has been changed to reflect how they're pronounced in Ukrainian from their Soviet-era spellings. And similarly, I think Hentaigana being made obsolete also had a political reason because of the whole Meiji Restoration happening in the background. And Japan needed to put behind its feudal past and embrace capitalism, Western culture, and industrialize. So I guess what I'm saying is, don't feel too bad about Hentaigana being gone because what's done is done. And had Japan not industrialized, it might never have become what it is today, and you might never have gotten interested in its culture and language. So thanks for watching episode 5 of Kana series. There is an extra video on how to input Hentaigana on computer, like what I did for this video if you are curious to know. It should be on the end screen right now. The next episode will be the last one, where we'll be covering polysyllabic kana and kana ligatures, which is when they combine 2 or more kana into one character, if you could call it that. Some of them even feature Hentaigana, hence the ordering. This episode took me quite a few months to produce. Me being lazy was definitely one of the reasons, but also had to take my time checking to make sure I'm not making mistakes and misleading you guys, since I'm a programmer by the day and this is more of a hobby. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. And I also have a Twitter account. If that's your thing, follow me on Twitter, links in the descriptions. Bye, and don't forget to be awesome.